If you were around during the 1990s and watched any film that involved a space station, it was always the same one. In the same way that today, the public consciousness's understanding of a space station is dominated by the International Space Station, in the 1990s, that was Mir. Built and operated first by the Soviet Union and then by Roscosmos after the fall of the Soviet Union, Mir pushed a lot of boundaries. It was the first space station to consist of more than a single part, pioneered modular assembly, and was inhabited for 3,644 days from 1986 to 2001. It was humanity's first attempt at a semi-permanent orbital research station following the highly experimental Salyut and Skylab stations, and paved the way for the next 30 years of continuous human presence in low Earth orbit. At the same time, Mir was also highly experimental, and in many ways, kind of a disaster. Let's be honest, basically everything humans have sent into space has been experimental to some degree, but Mir was treading previously untouched ground. Because of this, Mir had its fair share of problems. Following the trend of Soviet and Russian, somewhat lax standards of quality control, Mir experienced some unprecedented and genuinely alarming moments throughout its lifetime, and hopefully we'll be able to explore all of those today. Let's dive in, beginning as always at the beginning. But first, maybe the Soviets wouldn't have had quite so many problems with Mir if they had today's online learning tools at their disposal. Segway! Today's video is sponsored by Brilliant. Brilliant is a website and app that teaches you a variety of STEM concepts, ranging from geometry to calculus to quantum mechanics. Emphasizing on learning by doing, Brilliant allows you to directly interact with and manipulate the materials visually, rather than just sitting through a boring lecture where the knowledge might not quite sink in like it should. The problems scale in complexity to let yourself familiarize yourself with the material step by step, and there's always an opportunity for helpful hints should you end up getting stuck. They've recently launched a lot of new content, expanding their library of subjects that are available to you and allow you to start from any level of understanding. Brilliant has over 50,000 5-star reviews across various app stores, and its courses are crafted by award-winning teachers from schools like Caltech and Google. If this makes you interested at all, use my special link at brilliant.org/DKIS to get a 30-day free trial and 20% off the annual premium subscription today. That's brilliant.org/DKIS. Brilliant. Learn by doing. Quick disclaimer like I did with my Werner von Braun video. I am Canadian. I speak French et un petit peu français, but my Russian is not so good, so if I mispronounce something, I am sorry in advance, particularly to the engineers and the cosmonauts. Polite corrections are welcome, with the usual emphasis on polite. I'd also like to point out that I'm not going to be systematically going through every single expedition and event, as there is 15 years of time to scrub through here. I'll just be going through the big events as well as the less known, obscure but interesting events. As always, I encourage you to find more resources on these things, as there is a lot to learn about the history of the Mir space station. From even the early days of the Salyut program, the goal had always been to develop the way to large, modular, permanent living spaces in low orbit. The early Salyut and Almaz stations, as the two programs were somewhat mixed together to hide the secretive military nature of the Almaz program, essentially focused as engineering testbeds, and they frequently had problems. Salyut 1 was visited by only 2 crews, one of whom failed to dock, and the other sadly perished shortly before re-entry and landing. A second station failed to reach orbit, and the third, Salyut 2, lost control and depressurized 2 weeks into its life. A fourth, given a Cosmos designation, also failed to reach orbit. The remaining stations moving forward were fairly successful. Salyut 3, technically the 5th station, was the first military Almaz station to actually operate, and featured the first firing of a conventional weapon in space. Crew members fired a modified aircraft cannon on board, and had to move the entire station in order to aim it. Intending to see 3 crews, the secret of Salyut 3 only saw 1 crew before its mission was concluded. Salyut 4 saw 2 crews, and Salyut 5, the final Almaz station, saw 2 crews while a third failed to dock, and a fourth was cancelled. By 1977, Salyut entered its second phase, aiming for more long-duration stays and truly laying the groundwork for Mir. These stations would experience more crew transfers, more uncrewed resupply crafts, and establish precedents for the way things would work in the future. These new stations had 2 docking ports, allowing for multiple visiting crafts and for longer duration crew visits. 6 long-term crews could stay with support from 10 short-term crews who would arrive in newer Soyuz crafts and leave in older ones, ensuring that the long-term crews always had the newest craft available to them if they had to leave in a hurry. It featured the first international visits from cosmonauts of countries from the Warsaw Pact, also the first spacefaring peoples from countries other than the United States or the USSR. The first second-gen station, Salyut 6, was occupied intermittently by a total of 14 different people and was visited by 12 Progress resupply crafts. At this point, the program started to turn around, its reputation improving, and the idea of long-term spaceflight beginning to seem more viable. By the end of the Salyut program, the plan shifted to modular design. They were never launched under the Salyut name, but two core modules, DOS-7 and DOS-8, were constructed with the intentions of having up to 4 other modules docked to them to create a more expansive living space. DOS-8 would be reserved for a later project, which we'll come back to, but DOS-7 would eventually evolve into the core of a new space station, Mir, a word that is often interpreted to mean peace, but can also simply mean village, community, or world. Mir was actually approved back in 1976, before the Salyut program had actually entered its second phase. Its development continued throughout that second phase, with one of the Salyut modules being kept and modified for the core of Mir. The DOS-7 module was intended to be the primary living space for Mir, comfortably fitting 2 cosmonauts inside their own cabins for sleeping in privacy, having a toilet, an entertainment area for movies and music, and exercise and medical equipment. It also featured a command center, a centralized area for operating the entire station once it was completed. The original plan as of 1978 had been to connect 2 modules derived from Soyuz spacecraft on either side of the DOS-7 core, with their descent and orbital modules replaced with larger laboratory sections. By the next year, the design was modified to reinforce the docking ports so that they could accommodate TKS-based modules. There was also now 6 docking ports in total. 4 of them were located on one end radially for station expansion purposes, while the other 2 ports were lateral, with one located at the far end of the berthing node and the other at the opposite end of the module. The TKS spacecraft, originally developed in the 1960s, were intended to be fairly large combination cargo and crew craft for the Almaz program, but never ended up flying operationally. It would instead go on to be the basis for several modules for Mir, but because they were larger and heavier than the original proposed modules, the core DOS-7 module needed more work. Mir development slowed down for quite a while in the early 1980s. At that time, the Soviet space program was heavily focused on the ongoing Buran program. That is in itself something of a can of worms, so I won't go into too much detail. Just know that Energia Buran was a response to the United States Space Shuttle program, utilizing a suspiciously similar orbiter designed through industrial espionage, and a launch system that could be modified to support other payloads outside of the Buran shuttle. Development of Buran proved to be exceptionally expensive and time-consuming, so by early 1984, work on developing Mir had all but halted in favor of it. However, there was a lot of pressure to get the station's assembly started by 1986, and the base block was shipped to Baikonur Cosmodrome in May of 1985 for systems testing. There, it was quickly discovered that 1,100 cables out of its 2,500 required reworking and wasn't ready to be rolled out of its cleanroom until October. After several failures of spacecraft communication testing, the Mir core module was successfully launched on February 19, 1986, on a Proton rocket. In true Soviet fashion, there is exactly 1 photo and 1 extremely poor quality video of this momentous event. This is going to be a frustrating video to edit, I can already tell. The core module was launched without crew, and none would visit it until almost a month after it was deployed. At that time, the final Salyut station, Salyut 7, was still in operation, so the station's first crew visit was also the first time 2 different space stations were visited on a single mission, and to my understanding, the only time that's happened to date. This mission was Soyuz T-15, otherwise known as Mir EO-1, and now a quick note on Mir expedition naming schemes. All crews that were long-term residents of the station, otherwise known as principal crews, were named EO-number, with EO standing for Expedition Operations. Shorter-term visitors to Mir were given the designation EP-number, which means Visiting Expedition. Trust me, it makes more sense in Russian, translated from Ekspeditsiya Pozitchnya. We'll also go over most of the uncrewed progress flights, especially as some of them are very significant to the station's life, but they didn't get a special designation, just Progress-number and then Progress-M number once the M-class Progress spacecraft was used. Also, fun fact I learned while researching here, the Salyut name of the previous program means firework, which seems like a really, really bad name for a space program. It can also mean salute, but like, come on. One last thing I want to go over is the spacecrafts we're going to be dealing with in this video. While the US used a variety of crewed and uncrewed spacecraft throughout their space station history, the Apollo CSM, the Shuttle, SpaceX Dragon, Cygnus, the Soviets and later Roscosmos have used essentially one: Soyuz, which means Union. First developed in the 1960s for the Soviet crewed lunar program, variants of Soyuz were the only crewed spacecraft ever flown by the USSR following Vostok and Voskhod, excluding Buran, which never actually saw a crewed flight. The Soyuz layout consists of three primary components. At the rear is a service module which contains propulsion, fuel, power, and life support systems. At the front is the orbital module, which crew are in for ascent and in-orbit operations, and in the middle is the descent module, which crew will move to for re-entry and landing. Soyuz launches in one piece and extends solar panels from the service module once in orbit. Following a deorbit burn, the three modules separate and the orbital and service modules will burn up on re-entry, while the descent module lands via parachute. Similarly, Progress, the cargo spacecraft, is basically just an uncrewed Soyuz. Instead of a descent module, it features an unpressurized propellant and refueling compartment in the middle, and the pressurized forward module is used for cargo, though it can be boarded by crew when docked to another spacecraft. Upon deorbit, the entire Progress is destroyed during atmospheric re-entry. So, Soyuz T-15. Launching on March 15, 1986, this flight occurred in a very strange place due to the political climate. The original intention had been to launch the newer Soyuz TM spacecraft, as well as possibly launch and dock at least one new component before occupying the station, but the timing simply wasn't there. First, Soyuz T-15 went to Mir, docking with the core module's forward port 2 days after launch. Because it didn't have the newer Cryistal docking system that would later become standard, the old system required it to approach the station's rear docking port, then take manual control and maneuver around to the other side. Cosmonauts Leonid Kizim and Vladimir Solovyov then boarded the station for a 6-week stay, getting it ready for future use and performing the first experiments, which included testing the station's voice relay system. During their stay, Mir's orbit was adjusted twice, first to lower the orbit to match that of Salyut 7, then again to put Mir on a close approach path with the older station. They received 2 Progress spacecraft during their stay on Mir, outfitting the station for future visits. While the expedition was ongoing, tensions between the USSR and the USA began to flare up. US officials accused the Soviet Union of conducting military experiments aboard Mir, which was supposed to be a civilian space station. Not a baseless claim given the Almaz program, though Leonid Kizim stated in an official press conference after his return to Earth that, quote, "The US is accusing us of this sort of action in order to justify their own plans to extend the arms race into space." The Reagan administration quickly fell silent with their accusations following this. After their 6 weeks aboard Mir, the crew departed and headed for Salyut 7. It took them 29 hours to cross the distance of 2,500 kilometers, and when they docked and got inside, they saw a depressing sight within the station that had been placed into a safe mode and empty for 7 months. It was completely frozen and without electrical power. They spent several days restoring the power and heat, and then performed 2 spacewalks to retrieve the results of experiments left outside by the previous crew. That crew's commander had fallen ill, forcing them to cut the mission short, and making them unable to finish and retrieve the experiments themselves. While they worked, Mir was maneuvered twice by ground control, raising its orbit slightly to drift closer to Salyut 7. When the crew departed Salyut 7 with around 400 kilograms of experiments, they spent another 29 hours returning to Mir, spending 20 more days there, primarily doing Earth observations. They left and landed on July 16, 1986, after a record-breaking 125-day flight and the final flight of the Soyuz T, which would then be replaced by the Soyuz TM. Shortly after Soyuz T-15 landed, Cosmos 1686, a modified TKS spacecraft which had been docked to Salyut 7 in the previous year, boosted its orbit to prevent it from decaying until 1994. However, unexpectedly high solar activity accelerated the decay rate, and Salyut 7 underwent an uncontrolled re-entry in February of 1991, with pieces crashing in a small town in Argentina. Shortly after the next crew would visit the briefly empty Mir, a second module would be added, Cavant 1, a new type of module designated the 37K. Sporting a flight computer and orientation system originally developed for the Almaz program, Cavant 1 was equipped with an astrophysics payload, making it the first designated science module for Mir. It was divided into 4 small compartments, 2 pressurized working compartments, 1 unpressurized compartment for experiment stowage, and a small airlock used to access telescopes and retrieve film canisters. As for scientific equipment, Cavant 1 featured an astronomy telescope suite with 4 instruments, an ultraviolet telescope, a magnetic spectrometer, and an electrophoresis unit used for separating particles based on their electrical charge. Originally intended for docking to Soyu 7, Cavant 1 was delayed in order to be outfitted with a propulsion system, a TKS-derived module called the Functional Service Module, or FSM. It launched on March 30th, 1987, nearly 2 months after the crew of Soyuz TM-2 arrived at Mir aboard the Proton rocket. Allegedly, Cavant 1 was the heaviest payload to be lofted by a Proton at the time, and significant modifications had to be made to the rocket in order to be able to perform the job. Following rendezvous a full 10 days after launch, Cavant 1 approached the aft docking port of the Mir core module as Soyuz TM-2 occupied the forward port. It achieved a soft dock but was unable to hard dock. Essentially, the two modules were only loosely connected with no proper seal between the two docking ports. This state was dangerous. Any attempted reorientation of the station could damage either or both docking ports, significantly hindering further expansion. The crew of TM-2, also known as EO-2, Yuri Romanenko and Alexander Levakin, quickly prepared an emergency spacewalk. Once out there, both crew members approached the connection point, finding some loose debris preventing the ports from fully connecting, and the crew spent 3 hours and 40 minutes removing it. What was it? A trash bag. Believed to be left by a previously departing cargo vessel, the bag had managed to drift in between the two docking ports and became pinned between them when the docking occurred. The day after the spacewalk, the FSM was separated from Cavant 1, no longer needed at this point, and sent into an orbit 41 kilometers above Mir. It would remain there until atmospheric drag pulled it down into an uncontrolled re-entry just over a year later. Meanwhile, after the FSM was gone, the crew entered Cavant 1 for the first time. Over the next 2 months, 2 Progress spacecrafts arrived to continue to outfit the station, and an extra solar array that was stowed aboard Cavant was installed to the core module in a spacewalk, boosting the station's electrical capacity to 11.4 kilowatts. 2 months later, the crew of EO-2 had their first visitors who came aboard Soyuz TM-3. Originally intending to visit Soyuz 7, EP-1 had a 3-person crew that included the first Syrian astronaut, Mohammad Faris, and another crew member, Alexander Alexandrov, replaced Alexander Levakin as commander of EO-1. The visiting crew stayed for less than a month, focusing on observing Syria from space and praying for minimal cloud coverage before they left on July 29th aboard the Soyuz that had brought EO-2, leaving them with their newer spacecraft and starting the trend of rotating the Soyuz spacecraft for long-term cruise. One interesting thing to note about Mohammad Faris's trip to Mir is that he almost didn't make it. According to an interview with him, one day, his wife came downstairs from breakfast shaking in fear. She told Faris that she had stuck her hand in the shower and received an electric shock, and was very grateful that she hadn't simply stepped into the shower. After returning from Mir, Faris was nervously approached by Alexander Viktorenko, the third crew member and commander of EP-1. Quote, "Mohammed, we are competitive in our trips to space, but we don't kill each other." Faris, confused, asked what he meant. Viktorenko reminded him of the electric shock incident and said, "It's now apparent that your backup, Munir Habib, had been the one to set it up." Habib apparently actually made 2 attempts on Faris's life in order to replace him for the trip, the second being the sending of toxic materials that were intercepted at Damascus International Airport. Notice how I managed to remain unconfused and unfazed at the fact that on this first set of crews there were 3 different cosmonauts named Alexander? Giving myself a pat on the back for that one. Be prepared, as in total, Mir saw 10 different cosmonauts named Alexander, 2 of which had the same surname. After a string of 6 relatively uneventful Soyuz visits that included more first-time international guests, Abdul Ahad Mohammed from Afghanistan and Jean-Luc Chrétien from France, the station was left unoccupied on April 27, 1989, when the crew of EO-4 departed. It remained this way until September, when Soyuz TM-8 brought the station back into operational status for its longest stint of activity and its second round of expansions. The crew, returning Alexander Viktorenko and Alexander Serebrov, keep in mind that it was Alexander's second trip to Mir, but for Alexander it was the first, spent around a month and a half bringing the station out of hibernation and preparing it for the new Cavant 2 and Cryistal modules. Cavant 2 was the first Mir module derived from the TKS spacecraft. It consisted of 3 compartments, a proper EVA airlock, an instrument and cargo compartment, and an instrument and experiment compartment. The airlock contained the Soviet version of the manned maneuvering unit for their Orlan spacesuit, called the SPK, which would allow for fully autonomous free-floating spacewalks controlled by small thrusters. Similarly to NASA, the SPK would be tested only a few times, and then was stowed in Cavant 2, then eventually moved outside the module as seen here. Cavant 2 included a massive suite of scientific experiments, including a variety of spectrometers and cameras, cosmic ray and charged particle detectors, and a bird egg incubator. Cavant 2's launch was delayed by 40 days due to faulty computer chips, eventually lifting off on November 26, 1989. After rendezvous, it was realized that one of the module's solar arrays had not deployed correctly, and the discovered solution was to roll the craft and simultaneously rotate the array, which allowed it to come loose, fully extend, and lock into place. Cavant 2 then approached Mir's front docking port, and at 20 meters, the Kerr's control system terminated the approach, sensing that the spacecraft was moving too quickly. The cosmonauts took manual control of Mir and moved in for a second attempt, which succeeded. After docking to the forward port, a robotic arm called Lyapa, which several modules were fitted with, was used to reposition Cavant 2 to the top lateral port, where it remained. The crew's Soyuz was then moved to the forward port to allow an incoming progress to dock to the aft port. Something worth noting, the Lyapa arm is not actually called the Lyapa arm. Every single English source in existence lists it as such, but then immediately mentions that the word does not exist in Russian and is probably a corruption of another word that means paw, like a bear paw. Officially, the arm was called ASPR, and I think that's a fantastic way to convey information, to say, it's called this, but actually nobody calls it that. Thank you, Soviet space program and unrelated record keepers, very cool, appreciate you keeping things simple and not at all nonsensical. Anyway, early in 1990, the cosmonauts performed 2 EVAs to test the new SPK unit, remaining tethered to the station in case it should malfunction. While the NASA MMU was completely untethered, the space shuttle was more easily able to retrieve a stranded astronaut. Mir was not, so extra safety measures were taken. After these final EVAs, the relief crew, EO6, arrived, replacing Alexander with Alexander, this time of the Blandin variety, as well as bringing Anatoly Solovyov to replace the other Alexander. The crew noted that several insulation blankets on their descent module had come loose. After some evaluation, it was deemed manageable, and EO5 returned to Earth safely. Originally named Cavant 3, Mir received its next module, Cryistal, in May of 1990, while the crew of EO6 was aboard. Primarily dedicated to materials processing, Cryistal made use of several furnaces to produce crystals in microgravity conditions. It was also notable for carrying 2 docking ports that utilized the APAS, or Androgynous Peripheral Attachment System. First developed for use in the Apollo-Soyuz program in 1975, APAS improved on the existing probe and drogue design of docking ports by being able to assume either the passive or active docking mechanism, whichever was needed, hence androgynous. These ports were installed for use with the Buran program, which had saw its first test flight 2 years prior. However, Buran would not survive the coming political turmoil, and while the APAS ports were tested with specially modified Soyuz spacecraft, they held virtually no purpose until something that would come a little later in Mir's lifetime. Installation of the Cryistal module went more smoothly than the others, and the EO6 mission concluded with the arrival of the next crew, who brought 4 passengers with them, Quail, one of whom had laid an egg en route. The next few crews continued as political tensions at home got worse and worse. A lot of the USSR's satellite nations were growing disillusioned with the way things were being run. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986 had been a PR nightmare for Soviet leadership, as their attempts to downplay the severity of the incident were quickly exposed, and with a new policy of glasnost, basically increased openness and transparency, many of the holes in the country's government were beginning to show. An empire held together by the threat of military force was faltering with the lack of a common enemy, the height of the Cold War having come and gone, and US-Soviet relations improving every day. In 1989, Boris Yeltsin made a diplomatic visit to the United States, and the simple act of seeing an American grocery store began to make him realize how dire the situation back home was. The writing was on the wall. It was only a matter of time. Soyuz TM-13, carrying the EO-10 crew, launched on October 2, 1991. When they would return to Earth, the country that they had launched from no longer existed. It's often said that one of these crew members, Sergei Krikalev, was essentially stranded aboard Mir when the Union collapsed beneath him, though this is slightly exaggerated. Similarly to the ongoing issue of the crew of Boeing's Starliner spacecraft, Krikalev's return to Earth was merely delayed for a few months while the Soviet Space Agency was dissolved and Roscosmos was formed. There was a lot of financial tension, particularly between Russia and a now independent Kazakhstan, where Baikonur Cosmodrome is located. Krikalev himself was actually somewhat ill-informed on what was happening to his home country. Glasnost wasn't really a thing on Mir, as his only sources of information were communications with Mission Control and a short conversation with his wife about once a week. He was told about the 1991 coup attempt and the breakup of the USSR, but the details weren't divulged to him, nor were the problems that were keeping him on Mir, such as a lack of funding directed toward resupply missions or assignment of a replacement crew. The team at Mission Control even threatened to go on strike at one point because they hadn't been paid, and Krikalev was also blissfully unaware of this. According to a documentary about his experience called Out of the Present, he was less concerned with his own fate and eventual return than he was about his family and how they were handling the turmoil on the ground. The budget for Mir was struggling, but eventually crew rotations continued, though the next expansion of Mir through the Spectre and Priroda modules would be delayed. On March 17, 1992, Sergei Krikalev's ride home was launched Soyuz TM-14. Some of the kinks in the cash-strapped Russian space program were beginning to be ironed out, partially through the announcement of what would eventually become the shuttle-mir program. Buran was pushed to the back burner for eventual cancellation in the next year, and the collaborative effort with NASA freed up some funds to continue the station's operations and expansion. The post-Soviet period of the Mir space station has begun. But first, we must discuss the unexpected guest that was discovered on board the station around this time. In 1988, cosmonauts aboard Mir noticed something that was beginning to blanket the windows of the space station, from the outside. It had even begun to slowly work its way inside of the station, slowly degrading the window's titanium quartz surface. It was fungus, presumably brought there by the cosmonauts when they came aboard, and it was strong enough to survive in the irradiated vacuum of low Earth orbit. Looking deeper into it, various species of mold, bacteria, and fungus were found infesting the station all over, eating holes into the aluminum with the acidic compounds they produced, damaging a fire suppression system, growing onto the wiring, and more. By the mid-1990s, the number of microorganisms living aboard Mir was found to be around 90. They were eating control panels, digesting the communications units, air conditioner, rubber gaskets around the windows, components of the Orlan spacesuits, cable insulation, and even seeping into the food and water supply. It was everywhere, and worse, it was proving to be impossible to eradicate. One Dr. Novikova characterized the bacteria as, quote, dangerously aggressive, and visiting shuttle crews would note that, while their spacecraft also experienced some bacteria growth, it was carefully tracked and cataloged, but on Mir, any attempts to do so quickly overfilled and outgrew the test containers within hours. NASA astronauts would report that the entire station had a smell of mold about it, and that in certain areas they became genuinely concerned about their health. So, how did they fix this problem? Well, they didn't. For all the rigorous cleaning attempts that were made over its life, the mold on Mir remained and thrived. The thing is, Mir was only intended to operate for about half as long as it actually did. One cosmonaut jokingly stated that the situation got that bad because the modules were never, quote, taken home for a proper cleaning. In fact, the state of the modules and their various filtration systems seemed to be worsening the problem. In 1998, cosmonauts removed an instrument panel, and behind it, found basketball-sized floating globules of murky water. Of course, they tested the water, and it too was host to a variety of microorganisms, including these dust mites. There was simply no way to keep Mir's mold situation under control once it grew to a certain point. Even today on newer stations, a similar problem exists. The ISS is home to around 14 to 20 species of microorganisms, though the problem is kept much more under control with modern air filtration systems and regular cleaning. The truth about the Mir mold is, though it was poorly maintained and got out of hand before it was realized how bad it was, it's a prime example of how life, finds a way. Bacteria is remarkably resilient, given that it's basically the oldest form of life in existence, at least on Earth. It also lends a lot of credence to the idea of panspermia, the idea that life on Earth originated off of Earth. In 1991, a new and rather iconic feature was added to Cavant 1, the Sephora girder assembly, installed over several EVAs by the EO9 crew. A 14-meter-long mast, Sephora would eventually hold on its end a thruster package designed to more easily reorient Mir with reduced amounts of fuel, but for now, it didn't have anything on it. So the cosmonauts, in an apparent act of insubordination, mounted a flag at the top of the mast, a Soviet flag. Over the following months, it was reduced to shreds and was eventually removed in late 1992. It was most likely one of the last places the USSR flag ever flew in such an official capacity. Throughout the beginnings of this post-Soviet period, the cosmonauts aboard Mir directly experienced the economic strain that Russia was under. The remaining two pressurized modules, Spectre and Priroda, were initially cancelled, indicating Mir would not expand any further than it had been. Part of the fleet of tracking ships used to keep communication with Mir were operated by Ukraine and were withdrawn from service following the Beloveza Accords, reducing the crew's ability to speak to mission control. Ukraine was also responsible for production of the Kurs docking system, leading to Russia attempting to reduce reliance on that system, with disastrous results that we'll get into. Parts of Progress cargoes were missing entirely when they arrived at the station, either because those supplies simply weren't available in the first place, or because ground crews at Baikonur had straight up stolen them off of the launch pad. Several of the mission control operators were so poorly compensated for their work that many of them moonlighted as taxi drivers and interpreters for some extra pay. This strained period of time did see one of Mir's more interesting experiments, however. Zamia, a satellite deployed from the forward end of the Progress spacecraft, was originally envisioned as a solar sail, intending to harness solar radiation as a means of propulsion. This is an old concept and has since been put into practice a couple of times, most notably by the Japanese spacecraft Icaros, which flew past Venus in 2010. Zamia, however, ended up not being used as a prototype solar sail. Its designer, Vladimir Syromayatnikov, boy, phonetic Russian naming schemes did not help me there, was the same engineer responsible for the APAS docking system and was struggling to find support for the solar sail project. Due to the strained Russian space program's financial status, there was little interest in funding the project. However, once he pivoted to pitching the project as a space mirror, it found its place in the Russian space program, with its first prototype, Zamia 2, being launched in October of 1992. A 20-meter wide solar mirror, it was deployed from Progress M15 after being undocked from Mir. When illuminated by the sun, it produced a 5-kilometer wide bright spot that traveled from southern France to western Russia at a speed of 8 kilometers per second. Bright enough to, from the ground, resemble a full moon, cloud cover across Europe prevented most from seeing it, though a few ground observers did report seeing a flash of light sweep across the sky. As Zamia's successor, called Zamia 2.5, was deployed on February 5, 1999. It was 5 meters wider than the original, making it capable of shining as bright as 5 to 10 full moons. However, soon after deployment, the sail caught on the antenna of the Progress and ripped. Mission Control attempted to free it from the antenna and were unsuccessful, forcing them to deorbit the craft. After this failure, the third, even larger Zamia was cancelled, and would unfortunately never be built. In early 1994, the crew of Soyuz TM-17 departed the station in an unusual way, passing by the Cryistal module as they did so. This was so that they could take photos of the APAS docking system in preparation for the upcoming shuttle-mir program. This program would genuinely hold up the rest of Mir's career, alleviating a lot of the financial strain that the program was under and returning it to more regular operations. Cosmonaut crews began to train alongside shuttle crews in preparation, and in February of 1994, Sergei Krikalev would return to space, this time as a Russian citizen, as the first cosmonaut to fly on a space shuttle, flying on Shuttle Discovery on STS-60. In the next year, shuttle-mir operations truly began. STS-63, launched in February of 1995, was referred to as the Near-Mir mission, being the first to perform a rendezvous with Mir and come within 37 feet of it. Essentially a dry run for the next mission that would dock, James Weatherby opened up the radio during the approach and said,
Mir, Discovery.
Discovery for Velocia.
Spaceships closer together. We are bringing our nations closer together. The next time we approach, we will shake your hand, and together we will lead our world into the next millennium.
EO-17 Commander Alexander Viktorenko, yes, that Alexander, responded with, "We are one. We are human." A symbol of the growing cooperation that was only hinted at with the 1975 Apollo-Soyuz test project, Shuttle-Mir quickly became a symbol of the end of Cold War tensions and the regarding of outer space as a neutral territory where two countries could work together for the good of humanity. Before docking began, some adjustments and additions had to be made. First was the arrival of Spectre at the beginning of June 1995. Ironically, originally intended to be a secretive military module, Spectre would serve primarily as the living and working space for American astronauts during the Shuttle-Mir program. Spectre was also partially paid for by NASA in exchange for allowing some 600 to 700 kilograms of experiments to be installed. The conical portion at the top of the module was a replacement, originally intended for its military equipment, and instead serving as a mount for 2 additional solar arrays. Spectre was mounted on the opposite lateral port that Cryistal was initially docked to, while Cryistal was moved to the forward node to facilitate the shuttle dockings. From what I can tell, its installation went smoothly, docking to the forward node, then being moved to the lateral port, then Cryistal was moved from its lateral port to the forward node. On June 27, 1995, STS-71 lifted off, carrying Shuttle Atlantis to the first docking of American and Russian spacecraft since Apollo-Soyuz 20 years earlier, as well as the first time a space shuttle docked to any space station since it never got the chance to dock to Skylab.
Copy. The Mir hatch is open. Concur. Say hi to Norm. We concur. We have a good image of you. Your go to open the shuttle hatch.
Okay, here goes.
For the 5 days they were docked together, the station and shuttle made up the largest and heaviest spacecraft in history. In addition to performing crew exchanges, the two crews did a number of scientific experiments together, bringing back the same spirit that ASTP had tried to inspire previously. 2 more shuttle missions would visit Mir before its final module, Cryistal, was launched and installed. Primarily dedicated to remote Earth resource observation, Cryistal was filled with LiDAR, interferometers, optical scanners, and microwave scanners contained in its most obvious feature, the SAR antenna. Its launch and docking in April of 1996 was something of a tense situation. The module was initially supposed to contain a deployable solar array, but delays and shifting of plans caused this to be moved to other modules. As a result, Cryistal relied on 2 redundant sets of batteries for power during free flight, and after launch, an electrical failure cut the power of those batteries in half. At the levels remaining, Cryistal would have exactly 1 opportunity to dock with Mir before the power ran out. Given Mir's track record for such things, it's fair to say that Mission Control was sweating just a little. However, they got lucky this time. Cryistal docked successfully on its first attempt. Before the shuttle-mir program ended, Mir saw one of its most dramatic and dangerous events. On April 6, 1997, Progress M34 was launched to Mir, carrying food, water, and other supplies for the EO-23 crew. Initially docking 2 days later, the Progress was then undocked on June 24th to perform a test the next day. Wanting to continue to reduce reliance on the automated Cryistal system and again lower the costs of the overall program, the test was to practice the Toru manual control system, performing several practice approach and dockings with the Progress. Unhappy with their first attempt, a second was made, using a monitor as a visual guide. Believing that the radar system had caused the monitor to fail on the first attempt, it was switched off, having only their visual aid to go by. The cosmonaut in control, Vasily Tsibliev, was unable to get any telemetry readings, not knowing his speed or relative position, going purely off of the monitor feed. However, the view on the screen was extremely unclear. Against the backdrop of the Earth, Vasily had difficulty seeing the station clearly, as it was nearly indistinguishable from cloud patterns behind it. 2 other crew members attempted to use laser rangefinders pointed out the windows to pinpoint the location of the Progress. However, the range and speed were greatly misjudged, and it was realized far too late that the Progress was hurtling toward Mir at a dangerously high relative velocity. As it passed below porthole windows, cosmonaut Alexander Lazutkin gave the order for NASA astronaut Michael Foale to get aboard the docked Soyuz spacecraft immediately.
That order that Sasha gave me, Vakarabel, don't stay and try and help us, don't let us use your expertise, don't let us do anything with you, just get out of our way to the spacecraft.
Everyone felt a thump, and the entire station shook, twice, 3 times. Mir had been hit, hard. The immediate sound of decompression alarms confirmed it. It had first bounced more or less harmlessly off the core module, then drifted up and slammed into Spectre with its aft end, which sent the forward end swinging into it to hit a second time.
And I heard what seemed to be far off, a kathump. At that point, I knew we had been hit by the Progress.
The pressure was falling, and Mir was spinning. Vasily monitored the situation and informed ground control, while the others quickly made a call to seal off the Spectre module, first disconnecting the power cables that ran through it and closing the hatch, leaving the station without power and severing radio contact with ground control. Again through quick thinking, the crew used the docked Soyuz TM-25 to stabilize the station and reorient the solar panels that were still operational. The crew spent the next few days working by flashlight to restore functionality to the station, trying to conserve what power was still available. The temperatures soared due to the cooling system not working at such low power, and the crew had to wait for Progress M35 to restore Spectre's other functional solar panels. Arriving on July 5th, M35 carried an apparatus that could be used on a spacewalk to harness the power from the Spectre solar panels, but this repair had to be delayed when Vasily developed a heart arrhythmia. He was ordered to take a regimen of medications to keep him stable until the relief crew arrived the next month, and he was finally able to come home after a very, very stressful expedition. And it is at this point I'm going to very quickly shill the Perigee Aero Shop, because they have merch for this. Oops, sorry, power well parking is hard. Excuse me, I just threw up in my mouth a little while saying that. Link in the description. By the way, did I mention that EO-23 suffered a fire? Yeah, that happened. Let's backtrack a little. On February 24, 1997, very suddenly, gray smoke quickly and completely filled the Cavant 1 module. The crew quickly grabbed fire extinguishers as meter-high lithium flames and molten metal from a solid-fuel oxygen canister spewed out into the module. The crew began to grow afraid that the fire would eat through the hull and cause a loss of pressure. The fire burned for a solid 14 minutes, and the crew used up 3 full fire extinguishers fighting the flames and beating back the smoke, donning respirators so that they could continue to breathe. The smoke remained for another hour, and after respirators ran out of oxygen, the crew switched to using filter masks, which would remain on for several days while Mir's air filters slowly cleaned out the smoke and damage. EO-23 was quite possibly the most exciting expedition in the history of the station, in the worst possible ways. All of the problems on EO-23 gave NASA pause for thought. Was Mir getting too old for this? Was it time to prematurely end the shuttle-mir program? No, they decided. There were only 3 flights left, and for all the difficulties encountered, the cosmonauts and astronauts had remained safe. Cosmonauts on the next crew had even managed to perform an IVA, that's intravehicular activity, donning spacesuits and entering the depressurized Spectre with several goals. First, they attempted to salvage some of the experiments that were within the module with mixed success, then sought out the source of the leak in its hull, then ran cables through a special hatch in Spectre to the rest of the station, beginning the process of restoring the power. Later, astronaut Michael Foale and cosmonaut Anatoly Solovyev performed a 6-hour EVA to fully investigate the damage that had been done from the outside. The shuttle-mir program officially came to an end with the departure of Shuttle Discovery on June 8, 1998, concluding STS-91. At this point, the writing was on the wall for Mir. It was old, it was falling apart, an entire module was permanently sealed off, and it was filled with fungus and scorch marks. There were plans for a replacement beginning all the way back in 1976, appropriately named Mir 2. The design of this evolved several times, beginning as a carryover from the Salyut program, becoming intermeshed with the Buran and Energia programs, and ending up as the core pieces of the International Space Station. Each design was based around the DOS-8 base block, and this would eventually become the Zvezda module, which provides the core life support for the ISS today. However, the truth is that Roscosmos was far too strapped for cash to seriously consider a Mir 2 fungal boogaloo. With Mir on the way out, investment was poured into their portion of the ISS, and Mir was even slated for deorbit as early as 1999, considering Zarya, the ISS core module, was launched in the previous year. Apparently, there were briefly plans for private interest to purchase Mir and turn it into the world's first space movie studio, but it's difficult to find a source on this and might be somewhat exaggerated. The final flight to Mir, the privately funded Soyuz TM-30, spent 2 months cleaning up and repairing the station in the hopes of making it livable and safe again, but at the end of the day, there was simply no money for that. Mir was done for, but it left behind an epic, haphazard, crazy legacy. A first of its kind in many ways, it was the only space station to have had a steady supply of cognac and vodka in true Russian fashion, and even had softcore pornography sent to it at one point. Thank you, Scott Manley, never thought I'd associate those two things together. It got bashed around, punched with holes, set on fire, filled with mutant fungus, and persevered for 15 years. But finally, in 2001, it was time to come to an end. Mir was deorbited in 3 phases, beginning in January of 2001 when Progress M15 docked to the station. After waiting for atmospheric drag to pull the station down a little, Progress then pulled it even lower with its engines. Finally, a 3rd Progress burn pulled it down below the Kármán line on March 23rd, where it began to be ripped apart by atmospheric forces. The largest piece of space debris to ever re-enter Earth's atmosphere, I think, Mir broke apart over the South Pacific Ocean without a single piece touching a civilized area. Maritime warnings were sent out to the local area to ensure no ships would be hit with debris, though the chances of this were low to begin with. Mir was no Mir. I'm sorry, terrible joke, but really Mir was impressive for what it was. At the same time, it does highlight the come-what-may attitude of the Soviet Union regarding the safety of spaceflight. They had a tendency to not think things through fully, fix problems when they came rather than anticipate them, and fly by the seat of their pants. In many ways, they were more of space cowboys than anyone at NASA ever was, and the result was the catastrophic mess that was Mir. You can't say it wasn't impressive, but honestly, you can't say it wasn't a little gross too. Here's to you, Mir. Let's close out with a distressing meme. You may want to lower the volume for this. Until next time, my friends. Do svidaniya. you.